Welcome, everyone. I am Anatol Lieven, Director of the Eurasia Program here at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. And it gives me great pleasure today, well, a melancholy pleasure in many ways, given the subject matter, to introduce a panel to discuss the military and political situation in the Ukraine war. Before we begin, just a couple of notes. First, please put questions to the panelists in the Q&A, which you will see at the bottom of your screen, and I will pass them on to the panelists. Secondly, on Thursday, Quincy is having something new for us, a series of conversations with leading figures, including Kurt Campbell, the newly designated Deputy Secretary of State, about US-China relations in advance of the APEC summit and the planned meeting between President Biden and President Xi. So I do hope you'll be able to attend that in 2 days' time. So for today, I have great pleasure in introducing a very distinguished panel to discuss the situation in and around Ukraine. Rajan Menon is Director of the Grand Strategy Program at Defense Priorities and Emeritus Professor of International Relations at the City University of New York. He has written numerous books, including about Ukraine, one of them being The Conceit of Humanitarian Intervention. Colonel Daniel Davis is a military veteran of 4 combat zones and winner of the Bronze Star for Valor in Afghanistan, and also a very prolific author on security issues. And Margarita Konaev is Deputy Director of Analysis at Georgetown University's Center for Security and Energy Technology. And she has written extensively on security issues, on issues surrounding AI and cyber warfare, and on the war in Ukraine. So thank you very much, all of you, for attending. So to begin, there have been some very striking articles over the past week or so in the US media on the situation in Ukraine, reflecting, of course, the fact that the Ukrainian counteroffensive basically failed in its objective of breaking through the Russian lines and driving the Russians back. And it seems also at the cost of very heavy Ukrainian casualties. And so strikingly, we have seen now for the first time interviews, an interview with members of President Zelensky's staff saying that they now feel that there will be no breakthrough, that we are heading for or already in a stalemate on the ground, something which only a few weeks ago really it was taboo to say, and describing Zelensky as borderline delusional in his belief that complete victory is still possible. And very strikingly, remarks by the Ukrainian army chief, General Zaluzhny, also recognizing the reality of a stalemate. So to begin with, Rajan, you have very great experience on the ground in Ukraine, including in talking with the Ukrainian military. How significant do you think these latest statements are? Is there either a major change of heart now underway in Kiev or a major split in the Ukrainian establishment? And where do you see Ukrainian policy going?
Well, Anatol, first of all, thank you, and thank you to the Quincy Institute. Much of what I'm going to tell you, Danny Davis and I have debated to death, and we may actually end up finishing each other's sentences. I think Zaluzhny is correct in the sense that there is a stalemate since the counteroffensive began, but it's also important to note that the Russian offensive hasn't really gotten very far, and that's notable because it is an offensive, and they have in every category relevant to military power an overwhelming advantage. So let's take the Northeast, their drive from the Svatovo-Kremlin line in the Northeast toward Kupiansk and then attempting to go to Kharkiv. They've tried many times, they haven't. They have an offensive going on in the south in Avdiivka. from both Vladimir in the south and then from Krasnohorivka. They've lost enormous people and equipment. I've stopped, Anatol, looking at casualty figures, and Danny, I've talked about this. I can't make sense of them anymore because there's so much spin. But the front line has been stable. So the question is, where does Ukraine go from here, given that much of what it needed to really succeed in the counteroffensive, air power, enough artillery, the missiles like the Taurus or the expanded version of ATACMS haven't been given to it. So it's in a very curious position where it can't do better, but if it can't do better, then it begins to look like a lost cause and pressure is on to settle. What kind of settlement can there be now? President Putin has claimed 4 provinces, only one of which he controls fully. And so the Ukrainians are looking for a partition of their country. I know no one in the 3 visits I've made to Ukraine since the war began that's willing to accept that. Now, you might say they're foolish, but nobody is.
Thank you, Rajan. Colonel Davis, I mean, it's often said, indeed, this has become conventional wisdom, that recent developments, well, not so recent now, over the past generation in military technology, greatly favor the defensive, and that this will or is working against the Russians when they try to launch new attacks. As Rajan has said, they are making only, it seems, very slow progress around Avdiivka. Do you see it that way, that Russia is also now stalemated, or is, in the longer term, time working against the Ukrainians? Is there a danger of a much bigger Russian victory in future?
Well, that's kind of the way I see it. I think that the longer time goes on, the worse things get for Ukraine, because it appears to me that Russia has made a calculated decision that they're going to go with this inch by inch theory, like they did in Bakhmut. They seem content to say, we'll spend, if it takes another 3 to 5 months even to take Avdiivka, even if it comes at high cost, they're willing to do that, because I think that it appears to me that Putin has said, okay, here's the manpower possibility on the Ukraine side. Here's my manpower potential capabilities. And in time, I can get this. So I don't have to take high risk, offensive, large scale maneuvers like we say the U.S. during Desert Storm or on many occasions in World War II, where you had these vast sweeping tank armies rolling around. I don't think those days are over in terms of human history. I think they can still be done if you have all the capacities, to Raj's point a second ago, if you have, significant air power, air defense, mine clearing capabilities, engineering support, and most importantly, lots of well-trained troops in well-equipped, armored vehicles. That thing can still happen, but it takes so much time to actually build capable forces like that. Neither side has the time under fire while they're fighting an active front line that's 600 miles plus to really do that. So I think that it appears to me from a military perspective that Putin has decided that he's going to go with just the sheer numbers and just tried to methodically roll through Ukraine. And Putin is also looking at the political and the diplomatic front. He saw that article in the NBC News where it's talking about European nations are now quietly telling Ukraine, hey, y'all probably need to start talking about making a negotiated settlement now. He sees the U.S. Congress separating Biden's desire to get $106 billion for Israel and Ukraine into 2 parts, so that we'll do Israel first, and then we'll see if we get around to the Ukraine part, and if so, what's it going to be? And he just sees that the interest even in the Ukraine war is waning because of the focus on the Israeli war over there. So all those things, I think he's calculating, time is on my side. And even if I have to go yard by yard instead of big sweeping moves, it'll eventually work. And I think that there's some plausibility to that, because militarily, I don't know that Ukraine can continue going on this just because they just don't have the manpower. And ultimately, wars are won by men, not machines. And those numbers, unfortunately, favor Russia.
Thank you. Dr. Konaev, would you like to comment on those two statements if you agree with them? Do you think that time is on Russia's side? And if so, do you have any sense of what Russia's war aims now are? Clearly, Russia has scaled back its ambitions greatly from the start of the war. But what is the Russian government now aiming at, in your view?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's be really interesting to see where we fall on this, conversation. I think in the end of the day, time and even manpower is a political question. It's a question of commitment. Yes, in a sense, you can run out of manpower, but in a couple of years, we might be talking about a situation where there is a greater participation of foreign troops on both sides, or even if it degrades to less training and more compulsory, drawing on whoever is still available in society on both of those sides. And yes, on the one hand, Russia does have the manpower advantage, but even that comes with a price. And I think from the beginning, we've made the mistake of underestimating Russian ability to suffer significant consequences when it came to their economy and when it comes to their manpower. So we definitely shouldn't underestimate what they're willing to take. But we need to remember that in the end of the day, the Ukrainians are not just defending territory, they're defending their status as an independent nation. And with that, I think the question of time, the question of manpower, and the question of will is in the end on their side, because they are fighting for their nation and their lives, and Putin is fighting for territory.
Rajan, on that score, I too, when I was in Ukraine, found, well, certainly nobody on the record to say that Ukraine could formally abandon its territory, including Crimea and the eastern Donbas. It does seem, though, that there is a sizable body of opinion now which might accept a ceasefire, which of course would de facto leave these territories in Russian hands, but would leave their eventual Ukraine would continue, of course, as would the West, to insist that this is Ukrainian sovereign territory. So, Rajan, do you think is it possible that we could move towards a ceasefire without an actual settlement?
One thing I've learned in this war, Anatol, and maybe you have too, is never make definitive predictions, because so much of what all of us have said has proven to be wrong. My view is that the Ukrainians certainly do not, as far as I can tell, suffer from a morale problem. Nor do they suffer from a military problem, because the West has the wherewithal to provide the arms it needs. They suffer from a political problem. Putin's calculation, and I think I agree with Margarita here, has been that the longer the war goes on, it will be much more difficult for the United States to keep in sync, shall we say, a 30-member coalition. And he believes time is on his side. I disagree with Danny to this extent. I don't think there's a Russian strategy of going inch by inch. That's what they've been able to do. They just haven't been able to do more. But at the end of the day, could there be a ceasefire and diplomatic negotiations? Yes, Ukraine now holds about 85% of its territory. I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs. It's not for me to advise the Ukrainian government that if they could get that territory in their hands and retain it and settle for something like armed neutrality, if they could then subsequently enter the EU, I know this will take a long time, that might be a deal worth accepting, but it's not for me to say. No one in Ukraine that I know is prepared to accept that deal. Margarita pointed out that their belief is they're not just fighting for war. If Russia loses the war, they don't lose a country. Ukraine loses the worry is that they could.
But I suppose, I mean, a question is, as you say, I mean, if the war stopped today, some 85% of Ukraine would be independent and would have the ability, in principle, to move towards membership of the European Union. It would certainly be emotionally and politically entirely pro-Western and anti-Russian. So, the question then becomes, does Ukraine risk a much bigger defeat in future? And so, Colonel Davis, I'd like to ask, I've obviously, like so many people, I've been looking perhaps wrongly at parallels with the First World War. It's an obvious comparison. And of course, there, what you had indeed was on the Western Front, a horribly bloody stalemate lasting for basically 3 years. But at some point, on every front, one side or the other cracked, starting, of course, with the Russians, but then the French army mutinied, the Italian army collapsed at Caporetto. The British and French would have collapsed almost certainly in the spring of 1918 if American troops had not been there to pick them up. And then, of course, finally, the Austrians and the Germans collapsed in the autumn of 18. I mean, do you see the possibility of such a transformation of the situation?
And I think that, and to Raj's point there, nothing can be predicted. And even those at the time of World War I, before they happened, couldn't be predicted, because it's interesting to note that all of those armies that broke, as you just mentioned, it's not like they ran out of soldiers or anything. They all still had the soldiers, but their will to fight, or their will to an ability to resist, finally got to some unknown point, and then it broke. And no one can say when that's going to happen here. I mean, it's possible that Ukraine could go on again like this for also another 2 or 3 years. That's possible, but it's also possible they could go for another 2 or 3 months. We just have no idea, because we don't have enough visibility. I don't have enough visibility on the internal emotional, psychological dynamics within the either side of the line, whether the Russian or the Ukraine side. But my fear is that point could be reached at a time and a place no one's prepared to deal with it. And again, this is just my personal assessment of looking at the military aspects of this and all capacities, logistics, training, equipment, the future potential, in industrial capacity. All of those things, to me, favor the Russian side, and I think that they will last longer than the Ukraine side was. And I don't even know what it would look like for a break, except that, you see in this the New York Times a couple of days ago, more and more knowledge about how the internal dynamics within the Ukraine government, military and civilian, are now openly disputing one another. And that's been going on for many months. It's just finally broken out into the open here. And one is concerned that, the guys down on the front line are also looking at this, and they're seeing this dispute, and it certainly can't help their ability or willingness to keep dying in large numbers if Russia keeps the pressure on. And, we just don't know when that may come. But I'll just tell you, militarily, I see absolutely zero possibility that Ukraine, either now or in the future, I don't care if they get the F-16s, if they get a bunch of ATACMS or other kinds of misery, can ever drive Russia out, because they withstood this whole basically 5 months of the summer offensive, but they didn't just stand pat. They were continuing to build defensive lines, meaning it's going to be even more difficult going forward than it is now. And Ukraine is going to have to spend another 5-6 months, probably minimum, even to have another shot at an offensive. And that assumes that they get the money and a bunch more equipment. And I'm not sure either of those things are going to happen. So I think that the mentality is Ukraine is going to come to the conclusion that they have to make some kind of deal, or their army could break and they could lose even more.
Anatol, can I have a very quick
Of
word
course.
on just this point? I know you want to go to Margarita, so I'll be very quick. Let's take the long view. When the war began, the expectation was that Ukraine would fall in 3 days. Kiev would be taken. In the event, the offensive against Kiev was beaten away. Remarkable thing, because they got as close to, say, if it was Washington, D.C., they got as close to Bethesda, Maryland. Then they swept the Russians out of the north, then Kharkiv, and then, of course, the right bank of Kherson. Since about September, October, they haven't made progress. So I think that barring a large infusion of military equipment, they're in trouble. If such an infusion occurs, and I think it's much more problematic now, they are in difficulty. But fundamentally, it's a political problem for them, as I see it.
If I may just weigh in on this point, I think we have a tendency, and in the West in general, I think because the United States has such an exquisite military and such a robust defense capability, to assume that simply because something is going poorly or something that is getting progressively worse, that it has to end, that it has to solve itself one way or another, that it's impossible that it will go on like this. But I don't think that's true. I think the Russian military can continue fighting poorly for a very long time, and the Ukrainian military can also very much continue fighting with a restricted set of capabilities also for as long as it feels like it needs to. So I think maybe this is perhaps driven by the media cycle or by our desire to keep ourselves in business as military and political interpreters of what's going on, or just having a momentum to the conversation that we are pushed to, predict or anticipate some sort of a resolution, some sort of an ending, some sort of a point of where things break apart. But that's not necessarily true. Things can go on in reduced capacity, in a less, severe type of war that is fought with significantly less capable people, with less exquisite equipment for a long time. And I think that's something that we need to be prepared for.
Yeah, and I'll just throw in there that again, there's so many unknowns, especially when you're talking about the psychology of a person fighting. But in terms of, I'm not sure the right word, justification perhaps, to continue to resist, I think that soldiers have to believe they have a shot. For example, in World War II, one of the most famous American battles was the Battle of the Bulge, where the 82nd Airborne Division was surrounded in a city in the Ardennes. The Russians had gotten around them around Christmas time and famously said, surrender or we'll kill you all.
I think you mean the Germans.
What's that?
You said the Russians. I believe it was actually the Germans.
Sorry for that. Yeah. Freudian slip there. Yes, the Germans had the Americans surrounded there at Bastogne and said, surrender or we'll kill you. And they famously said, nuts, we're not going to. And they continued to resist, and they were starting to really die. But they had reason to hang on there. They knew that they had Patton's Third Army coming up from the south. They knew that as soon as the air cleared, the weather cleared, that air power would come in. And there was reason for them to hope and hang on there. But if you don't see anything like that, and if you don't see there's support coming, then all of a sudden it's much more difficult to keep fighting if you don't see a path to victory, even if it's a hard one. And that's one of the things. I don't see a path to a Ukraine victory, military victory. Best they can do is hang on. And I'm not sure how many people are going to be willing to die for a stalemate possibility, indefinitely.
Here's the thing, though, just very quickly. Some version of this argument has been made from the beginning. Now, I've been to the Eastern Front, the Southern Front, the Northern Front, and I've talked to many frontline troops, including areas within a mile of Bakhmut. I have not met a single soldier who believes that they have no chance and that they will therefore lose. But let me add one other thing, Anatol, which we haven't talked about. For me, the biggest calculation the Ukrainians have to make is this. 20% of their population consists of either refugees or IDPs. The people who are refugees, some of them are the best and the brightest, mainly women. Will they come back? Will families get broken up? What about the colossal repair costs, which extend from an estimate by the World Bank of about 440 billion to 750 billion by the Kiev School of Economics, and that was about 3 or 4 months ago. If you go there and see the devastation, I cannot tell you, the pictures here don't do justice to it. There are entire towns that have been razed to the ground. And so that calculation has to, excuse me? In
the front line, but not Kiev or Dnipro.
No, in the front line. But those are important cities, some of them cities and towns. But so much has been destroyed, everything from hospitals to kindergartens to shopping malls to apartment buildings, that when the refugees come back, there's the whole question of how will they live and where will they live? So there is that calculation as well. Again, it's not a calculation for me to make, but that is a big question in all of this.
Well, yes, indeed. I mean, the future economic progress of Ukraine and the chances of joining the European Union are indeed, I mean, such a huge question. And of course, that is something that Ukraine cannot even begin as long as the war goes on. But I often say, you know, that I've been covering the conflict over Kashmir for 36 years now, and that's only half of the time that conflict has been going on. But then again, of course, you have had, I mean, it's not as if the basic issues have never been resolved. There have been, you know, repeated clashes. But of course, by far the greater part of that time, you have had, in fact, a ceasefire. I mean, an interrupted ceasefire, but still a ceasefire. So yes, I mean, to repeat, I cannot see Ukraine agreeing formally ever to surrender territory, but it's possible at some stage, I suppose, that both sides just run out of steam, basically. But I mean, yes,
the prospects for Ukrainian reconstruction are much more positive than with most countries that we've seen gone through wars and conflicts. And we know that the majority of refugees around the world don't go back to their countries for a variety of reasons, whether it's security or means or capabilities or whatnot. But because of the unique situation where, as you mentioned, the majority of refugees are women, and children, and there's a pretty high chance that their husbands and that their families are still back in Ukraine, and it seems to be a high motivation to go back. It's also an educated society, and it's also a society with high levels of, you know, technological skills and capabilities. And it's also a country that is rich in agricultural resources. So the fundamentals for that kind of enable a country's ability to rebuild itself after conflict are much more positive in Ukraine than they have been really in most of the places that we've seen attempt to recover from conflict in the last maybe 30, 50 years.
So one has to distinguish here, Anatol, between the long-term prospect for Ukraine, which indeed I would agree with Margarita are positive. It's an educated society. They have a very important high-tech sector. They're a major agricultural producer. And the baseline is good. But that doesn't address the question of who will pay for, over what period of time, given that Ukraine certainly does not have the money, what it will take to get the society up and running again to the point that investors will feel comfortable investing. So it's not the long term I'm worried about, it's the short term. And that is why I said that one of the things that the Ukrainian leadership has to think about, or I should think they should think about, is what are the long-term costs economically and socially for the continuation of the war. That doesn't mean they'll settle for a deal, but I think the people in the leadership certainly are well aware of this problem.
I mean, and something else that was, of course, dramatized by the Polish-Ukrainian spat over agricultural exports is that there are, in which, by the way, the Poles were, formally speaking, in the right, because the association agreement between Ukraine and the EU explicitly ruled out key categories of Ukrainian food exports in order to protect, well, precisely European farmers and the common agricultural policy. These are going to be very difficult, and one saw quite, well, from the former Polish government, of course, which has now fallen, but a quite hysterical Polish reaction over this. So yes, big issues to be discussed. Turning to questions from the audience, a very important point, I think, by John Muller. Hasn't Putin already lost the war? His initial idea, apparently, was to stop Ukraine's move to the west, not just to get a land bridge to Crimea. How is what he has achieved so far really a victory for him? I have to say this is a point I myself have made several times, that, you know, not just in terms of Russia's ambitions when it invaded Ukraine, but in terms of the context of the past 300 years, Ukraine could be seen already to have won a great victory, though not a complete one. But I wanted to ask, perhaps starting with Dr. Konaev, if there were a ceasefire proposal now along the existing battle lines, would a majority, in your view, of the Russian elites and the Russian population want to accept that? One. But two, would Putin, I mean, this is, I suppose, a silly question, because who knows what Putin is thinking, but would this be enough of a victory for Moscow, or do they feel compelled to go for more? If Putin really thinks that he's Catherine the Great, then of course he has to go for more.
I think that Putin or Russia's war goals have been redefined and reconstituted so often, it's nearly impossible to tell what they're fighting for and how much and how long and for what. But what they have done seemingly successfully, at least for their own domestic population and some parts of the world outside of the West, has been able to redefine this war not as Russia versus Ukraine, but as Russia versus the West. And having done so successfully, I think the specifics of the territorial compromise or deal, if such is to come at any point, matter less, because the story will go that Russia has been capable to fight a war against essentially a NATO country, NATO itself, because Ukraine has been armed and supported and, you know, brought up by significant Western, NATO, US influx of weapon and political support and whatnot. So Russia doesn't really seize itself and doesn't really tell the story of themselves fighting Ukraine. They tell the stories of themselves fighting the West. So again, I think the details on what's on the ground when the day that this ends come are going to matter less, and it's going to be much more this myth of how Russia resisted Western imperialism, however ridiculous that is, but that's a point that sells.
Anatol, before we forget, can I take a crack at answering John Mueller's very good question? Implicit in his question, I don't want to speak for him, is a distinction between a military victory and a strategic victory. Now, let us assume, for the reasons that Danny said, that the Russians eke out something that we can all agree is a military victory. It will not be a strategic victory, however, for some of the reasons, Anatol, that you implied. When the history books are written, I think Vladimir Putin, ironically enough, will go down as one of the prime contributors to modern Ukrainian nationalism. Absolutely. There used to be a time when there was a distinction made between the Russophone South and the Russophone East and the rest of Ukraine. At the best of times, that was a simplification, but that division has been erased now. You can go to the front lines and talk to soldiers who will talk to you in Russian, and you think they're talking to you in Russian because they want to be able to converse with you, but lo and behold, they talk to each other in Russian. And they are either ethnic Russians or Russian speakers fighting their Russian. So Ukrainian nationalism has emerged, and it is going to be defined by, I hate to say, a certain degree of antipathy toward Russia. That's point number one. Point number two, the die has been cast in another way. Ukraine irrevocably sees its fate as linked to the West, whether it's part of NATO and the EU or not. And then finally, Russia has burned its bridges with the West for some time to come. and as if the tender mercies of the Chinese. Now, if you roll all that together, I think you have a very interesting situation where you could have a military victory, but not a strategic victory in the sense that a victory that puts Russia in a better place than it was at the outset of the war.
Yes, I mean, there is another question, though, obvious question about the impact of the US political process. We've seen, considerable pushback in sections of the Republican Party, against continued support for Ukraine. There is this sort of what you might call ultra-realist or hardline realist line that America must concentrate on China as the biggest enemy and cannot afford, other conflicts. I mean, perhaps I could turn to Colonel Davis first on this. I mean, how solid is US support for Ukraine, in fact? I fear that as far as the Europeans are concerned, I mean, all my information is that they will basically tag along after America, whatever happens. But what do you think, Colonel?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, you're seeing the outlets play out already. I mean, over time, the support for Ukraine has continued to dwindle. And the percentage in a poll that came out just last week of Americans that think U.S. has done too much has, especially since the counteroffensive started in June of this year, it has progressively gone up until it's like 41% right now. And right now it's still on an upward arc. I think that this war in the Middle East is going to make that number go even higher, because people can see, man, we can't keep giving. We gave 113 billion or allocated 113 billion for the Ukraine war last year. Now they're asking for another 60 billion this year. There's no strategy in the U.S. for when this will be over. There's no definition for what victory looks like, how long. And I think more and more Americans are saying, why am I just doing this, with no end state involved? We just did this for 20 years in Afghanistan. It was disaster. And we just gave billions and billions with no end state, and it drained us for 20 years. And then it ended badly. Now I think people, and this is most prominently in the the Republican Party, but the numbers are also moving in the wrong directions, even in the Democratic Party, though to a lesser extent. But the trends are still there. So I don't think that anyone should count on American continued progress much beyond 2024. And if that's even assuming they get the 60 billion, which I think is quite unlikely, I think it'll probably be 40 or even half that much.
So
but
perhaps
Anatol,
I could ask
less than a month into the Gaza war, there's some sign that it may become a political liability for the president. We're now approaching the 2-year mark of the war in Ukraine. Can any of us really say that it has become a significant problem for the president, no matter what the polls say? So I don't think that's really the issue. I think there is a kind of war fatigue setting in. I think the right wing of the Republican Party would rather have done with Ukraine. The Israel war comes at a very unfortunate time, well, for Gazans and Israelis, but also for the Ukrainians, because there is a kind of zero-sum game in the sense that can you support Israel to the tune of several billions of dollars, and also do that for Israel. And of course, there's no question that Israel simply has a wealth of support and a depth of support in this country that Ukraine does not have and will never have.
Dr. Konaev?
I'm just going to say this. There is a tendency, obviously, the American public and public in general has a limited capacity for ability to focus on foreign crises. And that has political implications, it has election implications and whatnot. But I want to be clear that the argument that, right now we have to focus on Israel and abandon Ukraine will very quickly devolve into an argument that right now we can't focus on Israel, we have to focus on Taiwan. And then it will become an argument that will say we can't focus on Taiwan anymore. We have our own problems at home without any solutions to our own problems at home. I'm not saying that we either do it all or we do nothing. But I am saying that as a country that sees itself as a great power and wants to have global presence, we need to be able to entertain more than one crisis at a time and understand that our support and our promises to our allies and partners are intertwined, and how our support for Ukraine will pan out will be viewed and taken very seriously in China. So I don't see those issues as separate. I see them as very, very closely intermingled. And we have to be serious about our commitments.
And, you know, and I think that brings up a really great point. We need to examine what are our commitments and what are our obligations? What do we want our obligations to be? Because we can't do, there was a famous exchange with Scott Pelley on 60 Minutes with President Biden. I think it was 2 Sundays ago, where Pelley asked him, can we continue to support Ukraine and Israel at the same time? And Biden said, come on, we're the United States of America, the most powerful country in the history of the world. And, you know, that kind of captures the intent. But the reality is, no, we can't. We can't do everything all the time. And especially, and there already is a desire to start doing more for Taiwan as well. And God help us all if that thing ever blows up, because we can't do it all and continue to maintain the same power that we have of our own military capacity, because it is definitely less capable today than it was 21 months ago, because we've given away so much of our stuff that and lots of our ammunition that is now very difficult to replace. So there is a degradation involved there, and we can't do everything. So Americans need to prioritize and focus. What do we want to do and what is reasonable? Because we can't just say we're going to give $60 billion indefinitely a year to Ukraine, but then what is the right number? Because Ukraine's life depends on the answer to that. And I think that's what America needs to do as much as anything.
On this one, just very quickly, I agree with my friend Danny. One can say one ought to have commitments on many fronts. But my belief is that if both of these wars, Gaza and Ukraine, continue, there will be increasing pressure on the president not to do both. And I know which one will be chosen as the one to back away from. It'll be Ukraine. I don't agree, by the way, with the observation that the Chinese will take from whatever we do in Ukraine the lesson that they can roll into Taiwan. I think Chinese are very smart. They will do that based on the local balance of forces. They may have Ukraine in the back of their mind, but they can't overlook the realities of geography and the military balance and what happens within Taiwan. That will drive them. But I think there is a resource problem here, which will translate into a political problem. And the Gaza war makes a huge difference. I agree with Danny on that.
Yes, I mean, democracy has its effects in the end on foreign policy, whether one likes it or not. And, well, we also have elections in America next year, the outcome of which we don't know, nor do we know how exactly what role foreign policy will play in that electoral process. It is simpler from that point of view for Putin, not that I would recommend his system of doing things. On that score, there have been a couple of questions about the Russian population's capacity to bear casualties. And one of them pointed out that, you know, in the 1980s, the deep unhappiness in the Soviet population about casualties in Afghanistan did, it seems, have a definite effect on the thinking of Gorbachev and his his desire to seek an exit strategy from Afghanistan. So, I mean, what is your thinking about that? Will there be a point at which large numbers of ordinary Russians will start saying, enough, we cannot go on with this?
There's been no sense that I have gotten, notwithstanding people who say that Putin will fall tomorrow, the Russian Federation will fall tomorrow, that the war in Ukraine has been a serious liability for him. We've had no repetition of the Bolotnaya Square demonstrations. All of the opposition has been locked up. And while people may be unhappy with the war, I think it's very difficult to find empirical evidence that either the sanction or the domestical political crisis situation, has reached a crisis point, and that is what's going to force Putin's end. That may happen, but I don't think. I think pinning our hopes on a Ukrainian victory that results from Russia buckling under sanctions or because of political turmoil or the fall of Vladimir Putin is, I think, wishful thinking. I don't think there's any evidence of any of that happening.
I think that's a good point. And I would add that the distribution of Russian casualties right now is not equal among classes or geographically. It's concentrated in the poor periphery that is thus far being compensated for its losses. The families that lose sons receive some sort of a payment or an apartment or something that is, first of all, is a horrible way to think about it and to do it, but that's the process by which they are kept quiet or accepting it. There is really no mobilization across different sectors of society to protest the fact that, you know, the more vulnerable populations are paying even a greater price. That's just not something that Russia does in general. It doesn't really come around these types of issues. And right now, the upper middle class or the upper class of Russia is not paying for this war, not in really significant way, not in blood at least. So I don't know if Afghanistan was different in that regard, that it also saw a price for different classes of Russians and across different geographies, but the way that the casualties are distributed right now, I don't really see it being a factor for a long time.
One Russian interlocutor of mine said that if the West were really sensible, it would offer a ceasefire in an effort to split the Russian population and sort of force the Putin regime into a corner. And if the Russian government were sensible, it would offer a ceasefire in order to split the West of the Ukrainians. I don't know whether at any stage that is a consideration that might enter into both sides and affect them. But of course, it does ultimately come down to the decisions of the governments concerned about what their aims are. I mean, from that point of view, what do any of you have a sense now of what the Biden administration's aims are? Because previously, it was pretty clear as far as most of them were concerned. There was much talk about permanently weakening Russia, making it impossible for Russia ever to launch something like this again. Just now, we're beginning to have talk about the need for a ceasefire and the unlikelihood of a Ukrainian victory. What are your views, perhaps starting with you, Colonel, is there a plan, or of course it's sometimes a grave mistake to assume that governments actually have a plan at all, rather than making things up as they go along? What's your view?
Yeah, that's been a common theme on my YouTube show, Daniel Davis Deep Dive, where we talk about a lot of that. And we had a show yesterday where that was one of the biggest issues, that we can't detect any kind of a strategy that the United States has to even know what we want to attain. Other than this claim that was made early on by Secretary Austin that we want to weaken Russia. No one knows what that means, and how do you even define that? Because in some ways, Russia is weaker than they were by a large stretch prior to February 2022. And in other ways, they're actually stronger. They have now more actually combat experience. They've got lots of advances in electronic warfare, in drone warfare. They're now cranking up their industrial capacity. So in some ways, it's backfired, and they're actually stronger. But then internationally, strategically, in some other characters, they're very weaker. But that's just kind of an observation. It's not a strategy. So I don't know what the United States even wants to accomplish. And that's why I think it's so important that before President Biden gets another $60 billion for Ukraine, that he tells the American people what he wants to accomplish. Because if it turns out that he can give some sort of compelling vision that this is where this money's going, here's what it's trying to attain, here's how it helps American vital national interests and also helps Ukraine, people may be willing to keep doing that, maybe even for a long time. But if he doesn't even know what it's supposed to go for, how will he even know if it's successful? And I think people are going to be a lot less likely to want to support that. And I'm talking at the people level as well as the representative
level. Rajan, you agree with that?
Largely, yes. I think the Biden administration's policy of arms supplies that rather mystifies me, because it's been a drip, drip, drip policy of saying, well, we won't give this, and then in the end, you give it, be it Abrams tanks or ATACMS and now F-16s. But there's a kind of method behind the madness, as it were, because I think they're oscillating between two extremes. On the one hand, they'd like Ukraine to get as much territory back so it can negotiate an end to the war, where Ukraine and the United States and its allies can hold their head up high and say, well, Russia was dealt a defeat, not recapturing everything. On the other hand, and this goes to the point about we'll give you weapons, but you can't strike Russia, they are worried about nuclear escalation. And so toggling between those two extremities gives you some sense of why it is that there has been prevarication, hesitation. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I will just add one other thing, Anatol, on the question of weakening Russia. There's some who have gone much further and said what we ought to do is to precipitate the collapse of the Russian Federation. I think it's utter madness to think of trying to collapse a country with 11 time zones and thousands of nuclear warheads of all sorts, and assume with hubris that we can somehow manage the transition of that towards some modicum of stability, let alone democracy. We ought to have learned enough from our previous wars to let go of such preposterous notions.
I entirely agree with that.
It's interesting. I don't think those arguments about, weakening Russia to a point of state collapse are coming from the administration. I think those are more, people on the outside that have their own ideas and notions. I agree to a great extent, that if American money with this amount of money is pouring into a country, then America should have a say on where that money, to an extent of where that money is going and what we're hoping that it would achieve. But it does seem to me, and I don't know the internal calculations of the Biden administration, obviously, but it does seem to me that there is an understanding of limitations. This is not a war where the United States is actively involved as a combatant. This is not a war. This is not a situation where the United States can dictate the terms of the outcome of a compromise. And it's not a situation where the United States can tell Ukraine to accept outcome A or outcome B. And I think there is still, it seems to me, a belief that Russia can be significantly weakened, if not fully defeated militarily, and whatever end game that exists there limits it geographically to a significantly less viable portion of territory that it holds there, and whatever it is capable of holding there, it's demilitarized and continues to cost it militarily and in reputation and through sanctions. So I actually believe that it's a good thing that the United States understands its limits and what it is and should not be telling its allies and partners about their own foreign policy and their own national sovereignty. I think that's a point that we should learn, and it's a pathway for a respectful relationship.
Because this is being recorded for posterity, let me add a caveat. I'm not suggesting that the Biden administration's policy is to bring about the disintegration of Ukraine. I'm saying that people have written in this vein, and Anatol, I think we all know some of those names. Now, on the one hand, the United States can say nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. It's up to the Ukrainians to fight. But the realities of international politics are very brutal. If you are dependent almost wholly on a group of external suppliers, and the military supplier is overwhelmingly the United States, to think that the United States may not use its leverage when it thinks it's in its national interest to do so, to put pressure on the Ukrainians to cut a deal, I think it's not a serious proposition in my view. I think if we feel that it's necessary to do it, We will do it, and if we do it, the Ukrainians will be in very great difficulty. They understand this very well. They can say all they want to about they will continue to fight, but that begs the question, fight with what?
I suppose the point also needs to be made that, as we know from previous leaks from the Biden administration, there was always grave doubts about Ukraine taking back Crimea, being able to take Crimea, and the colossal risks of escalation if that happened, which of course means that even in the more optimistic scenarios or goals within the Biden administration, you were still looking in the end at a de facto territorial compromise, just one much more on Ukrainian terms, but still, not a total Ukrainian victory. That I think has been somewhat obscured in much of the discussion.
Well, and also, Anatol, this hardly ever gets talked about, but when Zelensky keeps saying, especially earlier on, that he wanted all of the territory back to the 1999 borders, I think, or 97, that included Luhansk and Donetsk, and they have been fighting basically a civil war for now 9 years because they don't want to go back. They rebelled from Kiev originally, and that's not something he's going to liberate because they don't want to be liberated. That's kind of an important point, I think.
Yeah, well, a point well worth making. I mean, going back to the start of the war, I mean, a question for you all, whoever wishes to answer it. Was there a chance in the first month or so, or 6 weeks, of a peace settlement, the Istanbul process? Could that have been achieved at that time? And how culpable is the West, I mean, including my own beloved ex-Prime Minister Boris Johnson, in blocking that? Or in your view, was that never really a viable possibility? What do you think, Rajan?
There were, in fact, 2 sets of negotiations. Before the war in Gomel, Belarus, and shortly after the war in Antalya, Turkey. Now, the received theory of this is that they came to a deal, and along comes tousled Boris Johnson, and he says, we'll back you to the hilt, don't sign the deal. It could have happened, it may not have happened, but I have no evidence it happened. I'm skeptical of this theory for one reason. Remember that when the war began, the assessment overwhelmingly of the American intelligence and defense community is that Ukraine didn't stand a chance. So it seems to be passing strange that the war would begin, and the first thing the United States would say when there was no plan worked out for selling arms to Ukraine, providing arms to Ukraine, is don't cut a deal, fight on. I think there could have been a deal. Why it fell apart could have to do with a lot of things, specifically the terms that the 2 sides could not agree upon. So I don't know is the answer, whether this happened, that is the West nicked a peace agreement. There were such negotiations. I understand from people who know that they came fairly close, but it broke down. It's neither here nor there because it didn't happen.
Colonel Davis, your view?
Yeah, I think I think it was entirely possible because ahead of those negotiations, Zelensky was talking the most optimistic towards making a compromise that he ever did. Saying he might even consider, sacrificing some of the Luhansk and Donetsk territories, or actually more to the point, he said that, yeah, we might say, well, we're neutral. We might let NATO go. That went away right away. And I think, again, as Raj points out there, until this is probably years after this thing is over before we'll know what was really going on during this time. But I know that for sure that this is about the time that the atrocities in the northern part of near Kharkiv or whatever were really coming out, Bucha and some of those, and just the emotions exploded when that hit the scenes. And if there had been anything, I think that might have helped seal him, whatever Boris Johnson may or may not have done.
Yeah, Danny, from what I've been able to piece together, I don't think there was ever an agreement to sign off Donetsk and Lugansk. Maybe there was an agreement on deep autonomy, but certainly Zelensky put NATO membership on the table. He said, look, we are not going to get into NATO, and I'll put that on the table. That was a very big ask. And I think because that was a big concession, you probably demanded something substantial in return from Putin that Putin was not prepared to to give. Now, that's my guess. We are all in the dark about precisely what happened here, what happened there.
Mm-hmm.
You should also remember that Putin doesn't negotiate in good faith. So whatever happened or did not happen on the other side, we should not assume that this was a genuine proposal or something that would have worked out in ensuring stability and preventing the escalation and continuation of the war.
True. Well, thank you all so much. I'm afraid that's all we have time for, but this has been a really interesting and revealing discussion. So I'm most grateful to you, and so is the Quincy. My thanks to the audience. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all your questions. And I do hope that some of you will be able to attend or listen in to our conversations on US-China relations on Thursday. So thank you all so much, and I'll see you again soon. Goodbye.